Hi, I'm Dean Bushmiller with Expanding Security, and this is non-repudiation principles and practices. Use or consumption of this material by AI is expressly forbidden. When I first thought about non-repudiation and talking about it, if you looked at some of my other videos on confidentiality, integrity, and availability, I included non-repudiation in with it. I thought it was a good idea, but I've since learned a little bit more about non-repudiation, and I wanted to share it with you. When we look at non-repudiation, we need to start off with just the basics here. And non-repudiation, well, what is this thing, non-repudiation? What does that actually mean? Remember the old kids game where you were out in the schoolyard and you'd say, okay, I go ahead and do this. I want to go ahead and do this. I'll sell you my marbles for this, or I'll sell you my trading cards for this, or I'll sell you my custom sneakers for this. And somebody goes, it's a deal. And then you go, well, I'm taking that back. And you go, no take backsies. Wait a minute, you've already said it. You can't take it back at this point. That's what non-repudiation is. It's no take backsies for adults when it comes to contracts. Usually we associate this with a contract. And it's an assurance that the signer of a document or a contract cannot deny it later. It's no take backsies is what it boils down to. How do we do that? How do we achieve that? Well, we achieve that by using digital signatures and digital certificates. That's how we should do it. Unfortunately, sometimes we're using something else that is acceptable by business. And there are a lot of tools out there that you will see that aren't true non-repudiation, but these companies have gone, oh, well, we'll take care of this for you. Okay, but remember, non-repudiation of what? Okay, when I look at it, I say, this protects my infrastructure and changes to contracts. We don't want any of that, contract stuff to get derailed by some sort of rogue user that's out there. We're talking about contracts here. Just to give you an idea, I just signed a contract, and this happens to be a DocuSign document, where I agree to do some training with somebody else. Is that my signature? No. The tool came up with that. Well then, Dean, this doesn't count. You could get out of this contract to do this training. Not really. From a business standpoint, if I get this document, it's delivered to me, and I go through this signing process right here, there's an intentionality to that. There's a process that I've gone through, and I've said I'm willing to commit to this. Business makes this contract agreeable, even though we don't have true non-repudiation at that point. What do we get? Well, generally, I look at the chain of custody on this that makes any kind of security audit much better. And that makes it, I would say, almost an absolute breeze. But let's break down the three components that we get. First, we get accountability. That's an identity mapped linkage. You said it, you can't take it back. I know it was you because you were there and you gave me a piece of evidence. It's the integrity of the communication so that the data that we're transmitting between us, if there's any kind of alteration on that, we can detect it. And then finally, the authenticity. And that's the source of origin verification. I know it was you because of the math that is behind all of this stuff. So how do we get this? How do we make this work within our organization? And we're going to look for battle-tested infrastructure that should be running silently in the background. We're going to crack this open a lot in the next section, but we get it usually through what we call signatures. Not the signature that you saw, that fake one, that Dean Bushmiller that was there, but cryptographic hash binding, those kinds of signatures. We get it through public key infrastructure where we have a certificate authority hierarchy that we use. And you're going to see an example of that in my stuff. We get it through timestamps where we know that we have a trusted authority. Usually this is like an NTP server, but it's a trusted time authority that we all agree to, and things are timestamped with it. This usually helps us out with logs, or it is a part of a log, and that gives us a secure audit trail. Generally, what we need is we need to figure out the steps in this. And I wanted to break this down and give you examples of each one of the steps so that you can confidently explain this, the mechanics of this to management as the security expert that you are becoming at this point. Let's start off with the inputs to the process. What do we need to make this all work? Well, we have to trust in the math, the cryptography, the cryptographic math that has been secure for the past 30 years. We have to say we know that that's the truth. I'll go into details later on, but generally what we talk about here is something like either RSA or ECC along with secure hash algorithm. Those are the two things that we use that are proven by long-term mathematically that they've been working. Then we start with a digital certificate. That comes from a root certificate. Oh, that's what this thing is. Yes, when I go and I dig into my machine, now in this case what I did was I have a Mac machine, I went into it and I went into the keychain access and I said, show me all the certificates that are installed on this machine. These are the root certificates that are used and signed usually when you go into a browser and you right click on the padlock and you open it up, it'll say, here's the certificate. And it'll usually show you the name of the site. Like if you went to my site, Expanding Security, I'll show you that in a second. But you could keep on going up to all the way to the top, and the top of that root chain would be one of the public key certificates one of the public keys that would be sitting inside of here. It would be installed usually in your operating system, but it also could be installed in a browser or other facility that you have. If you grab a hold of one of these things and you drill down into it, you will see that it has a whole bunch of detailed fields here. In this case, this is called the ISRG, and this is the root X2. That's better known as Let's Encrypt. If you look at this, you drill down into this, you find out a lot of interesting fields like serial numbers, the signature algorithm that they're using, when it's valid, the periods of validity in here. You also have the public key. That's going to be the really important one because that key there signs the next key down below it and signs the next key down below that, and so on all the way down until you get down to the entity, like Expanding Security. This certificate is used to sign other certificates. Well, actually, it's there to prove those certificates. That's used to sign the organization's digital certificate. If you were to drill down in, if you went to the Expanding Security site, you would see that, there's up at the top, it says ISRG root X2, and below that is the YE, and below that's the YE2. That's telling you about the certificates in the chain of trust, so the certificate authorities and their certificate that they have. And finally, at the very end of this, because this is Expanding Securities, you could get a field value, which is my public key. I can use that public key. Internally, I also have a private key, but I don't share that, and you can't get that from a browser, and that private key should be held private. This is all built on a chain of trust, and if you're interested in the Let's Encrypt chain of trust, you can look and they will show you exactly what's going on. The organization usually has either a certificate or a certificate authority. In the case of Expanding Security, I don't own my own, but just for a moment in time, let's pretend, how would I get one of those? Well, I couldn't go to Let's Encrypt, it wouldn't work that way. I would have to go to another provider out there and I would say, I want to set up a certificate authority. And they would say, okay, here are the rules, basically pay us a lot of money. Here are the rules, and what we will do is through our process, you issue a certificate here and you hand it to us and we'll sign that. That allows that root of trust to go all the way back to whoever the ultimate signer was inside of there. What that certificate authority is going to do is they're going to generate a public key, private key pair. They could even do it, and in the case of Expanding Security, if I had a certificate authority, I could sign a certificate for me. maybe we should have a little bit of separation of duties there. That might be a good idea, that I can't make my own certificate for myself. But at an individual level, I could get a key, and this is a fake key. I just want to let you know you can't see mine, and also it's been chipped off on the edge there. But this private key, public key setup would be generated. By the way, this one was generated at AWS, and usually I would use this to communicate through Secure Shell. But you get the idea that we have a private key and a public key pair. Now we get into the non-repudiation of it. We need to walk through the user process for all of this. Okay. Typically, when we're talking about email, we say, hey, we need an SMIME P12. That would be built for the application. And it would look like this gobbledygook right here. And we could gather all the data inside of here. But generally, that's generated for me, and then I use that. But what you normally see on the outside is kind of this beautiful interface here. What I did was I opened up my Apple keychain and I installed this fake certificate. And you'll notice that I've got a private key, a public key, a certificate. But you can also see that I have other certificates that are going along with this. This one is fake, and then those are the two public keys that are associated with it, but I created a bunch of them, and I can create as many fake ones as I want to. If we were to look inside and drill down into this certificate, you'll notice that this one is associated with, and if you zoom in there real tight, you can see that it's to a fake email address. This certificate is tied to transactions for this email address. I can send an email without using the certificate, but if I want to validate non-repudiation of that this came from me, I'm going to use this certificate in order to make that happen. There's also another piece inside of here that I want you to just take a quick look at, and that's the fingerprint. We're gonna need that in a second. Let's come back to that over here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a message and I'm going to hash that message. Again, normally this would be done inside of your email tool, but we're gonna parse it out and spread it out here. We'll start off with making a message. I went to a website and I said, okay, I want you to hash this text for me. And you can see it says, here's the message to you. I will sell you my house for $1 billion. This is a contract from Dean. And I can make that statement right there. That statement on its own, could I edit any little tiny piece inside of here? Yes, and that's why what we do is we assign a hash value to that particular text. How we do that is we do a one-way encryption on this material right here. Look at my cryptography section to go ahead and understand a little bit more about hashing, but this is a unique value that is associated with that particular text right there, and it's cryptographically unique. The likelihood of you being able to craft another message that would have a collision, basically the same hash value, is really, really unlikely. I've hashed that message right there and I have that message. What that does right there is that proves the integrity of this message. But see, somebody could intercept this message, it could create another message, create another hash value, and transmit them on down the line if they could get in the way and intercept that actual message coming out. This is where we take the next step. What I'm going to do as the sender is I'm going to encrypt the hash value with my private key. I hold the private key dear. Nobody ever sees that private key whatsoever. They see the results of that on the other side. I could sign the hash value with my private key. The hash value itself is it's a string. It's a small string at that point, and hashing that means that I'm using encryption, and that would be the normal way that we do it. Could we sign the message with a private key? Yes, we could, but then that's a lot more encryption that we would be doing. If I were to do this at the command line, I would use some sort of command like this. On a Macintosh machine, I can use an OpenSSL command, and I can say, this is the digest that I want. This is the key that I want you to use. Here's the output of that. I want a signature bin, and I want hash text. I want these details right there. Okay, What I've done is I've cryptographically signed that with my private key. Notice it says signed with private key. Who can decrypt this? What can they decrypt this with? That's where we come up next. What I will do is I will transmit that message, that signed message, to you. But remember, that's from me, the sender, to you, the recipient. How would I transmit that message? Well, generally, it's in email and all this stuff gets hidden in the background, but we could transmit this message through email, through carrier pigeon, through SMS, through Slack, it doesn't matter. We just transmit the message across. You go, well, Dean, isn't that going to break the confidentiality of the message? Why, no, because there was never any confidentiality to begin with. All we're trying to do is you're trying to prove that I sent you a message and I was the only one that could send it. We have to do the proof on your side. Remember, everyone can do this if they go through the process. What you can do is you can retrieve my public key if you want to. So you could go to this website right here, and there's the link for it that actually would open up, and it would send you to this website. If I publish my public key on my website, everybody can get it. But they really can't do anything with it. They couldn't encrypt something with my public key and then somebody else use the public key to decrypt. No. Because remember, the public key, private key pair has to be stitched together at this point. I can publish this public key anywhere. A lot of times it's in the system and you download that with the mail itself. So the application does most of this. There's a little hand waving that goes on there. You as the recipient have to validate that my public key, that thing that you just saw, is valid. How would you do that? Well, you've got to verify the fingerprint against an out-of-band trusted source. Where could you get that information from? Well, here what I've done, and you can still go to LinkedIn to this day, and you can look on the LinkedIn site, and you can see that I have a fingerprint of my fake public key published here. Let's think about this from an adversary standpoint. LinkedIn, you'd have to compromise LinkedIn and post as me. Maybe you could go ahead and steal my account if I didn't have multi-factor authentication in place. You'd have to compromise my website and upload a different public key there. You'd have to intercept my email message so that the person on the other side didn't get it. You'd have to create a new message, send that message along, make sure that this was changed, make sure that the public, see, there's a lot going on there. You got to do a lot of compromising in order to make all this work out. So I think it's going to be really low level, but generally what you could do is you could say, okay, here's the fingerprint of Dean's email signature so that I know that when I look at that message envelope that comes to me, that that fingerprint is consistent. This is just the fingerprint of my key. This is not the fingerprint of the message. You want to make sure that the key that you get from wherever you retrieve it from is actually my key. Downloading the key proves nothing. Validating the fingerprint of the key through an out-of-band resource does mean something. Next, what we do is, well, the recipient reads the message, okay? And so there's the message. I will sell you my house for $1 billion. This is a contract from Dean. Well, okay, how do we make this work next? Okay, well, what we do is the recipient, you, hashes the original message with the same algorithm. In this case, you could use the same algorithm here, and that would be SHA-256. You would have looked at that message, typed that message in here, and gotten that output there. Then what you do is you decrypt the hash value with my public key. You could do that at the command line if you wanted to. And notice here we're using the public key. Anybody can do that. That output from that will give you this hash value here. If you look at that hash value here and you compare it to the message, and that's what you do. The recipient compares the hash values of the message themselves. Do we have a match? If we have a match, then the message that was sent from me is the message that you received on your side. Gosh, Dean, that's an awful lot to do. Maybe we should be doing something else here. Well, the beauty of this is that all of this is swallowed up inside of our email systems, and we don't even see that it's actually happening. Every once in a while, what will happen, and one of my friends who's now passed on, BJ Gleason, would do a trick to me. And he worked in the military, and he would send me an encrypted message. And normally what I would do is I would go up and say, okay, I need to get to the DoD root level certificate so that I can prove that this message came from BJ and go through the chain of trust. Well, it turns out that for the US military, they don't even allow somebody like me who's not part of the military to resolve their PKI, to pull down that certificate for validation, to look at, and what would happen is when I would step onto his messages, it would like seize up my machine. Basically, it would brick my machine and I'd have to start over again. As long as we have communication with the certificates authorities, the root certificates, we can download them, we can validate the chain of trust, then all this stuff will work seamlessly on the backside. Okay, so let's put this all together because that was a lot of different steps there. Let's simplify things for us. Okay, we start off with the sender on that side, the receiver on this side, and then the certificate authority in the middle. The sender gets a digital certificate that they're going to use over a long period of time, and it's bound to them. We would go through an identification process. What Dean would show up with his identification, and they would issue me a certificate. Okay, and then we start the process where we hash the message, encrypt the hash with the sender's private key. We have a digital signature created, and then we send that message along its way to the next side. Then it gets sent over here, and what we do is we validate the sender certificate, me. Then we can do that through a certificate status validation. We can go ahead and say, is the certificate still good? We started doing this with OCSP, but we've changed back to CRL again. On the side of the recipient, you decrypt the signature using the sender's public key that you had validated. We hash the received message and we compare both hashes. If the hashes match, then myself as the sender cannot deny the original message. Whew, that's a lot to go through. You know all the components now. You can work through this math on your own. You can work through this on my website, and you can go ahead and build it yourself if you want to. What did we get and how? Well, we used a private key signature that shows that the sender's key signed the message in hash. The hash matched. We showed that the message was not changed. There's a certificate that links to a public key to the sender's identity so that we know that only Dean has the private key. Therefore, nobody else could do this unless they compromise his key. If they compromise his key, we could go to the certificate revocation list and we could say, has this key been compromised? It's my responsibility on the end user side of things that if my key gets compromised, that I immediately report this to my local certificate authority manager at that point. They're somebody who runs the PKI, and they would post that message up inside the certificate revocation list. This is only a really short window of time between when I have sent outgoing messages and my key got compromised, because if I hadn't sent any messages and somebody had stolen my key at this time, what they could do is reissue me a new key, and when I would sign new messages, it would be with the new, digital signature, the new private key on my side, and you'd be retrieving the new public key out there on the net. We also can get timestamps and logs, and if we're using this for evidence, which is another reason why we would do all of this stuff, is we would have an evidence trail that was admissible in a court of law. All this is done to build trust. Go, what's the value in all of this, Dean? Well, I'll tell you. Between you and us right now, we have a proposed price for my house, $1 billion. I know you don't want to buy my house. It's not that good. Okay. If you know that I know that you know that I can't take it back, we've got non-repudiation. And what that means is you can move on with your day quickly. And that's the key for business. Business wants to know that when they get a contract, that contract is good, and that if somebody signs that contract, that it's valid and they can't take it back and they can move on with their day. They don't have to show up, get out blue pens and black pens and sign things and create wet ink and all that for contracts. They can just sign this stuff and we never have to see each other. I've never met the person who I'm signing the contract with at that training facility. I've never seen that person in my life. I know who she is. I'm sure she's a wonderful person, but I've never even seen her face and I've never seen a wet contract, and we've been doing business for a long time. Now when I get a contract, I know this is true. I send it back. She knows it's true, and we have a deal, and I do teaching. We both move on with our day very quickly at that point, and we don't have to worry about anything else. The AI section here is very brief. Where does AI intersect with non-repudiation? Where is it a part? It's not a part of AI. However, we are doing another form of non-repudiation that is being used by a lot of internal AI systems today, and that's blockchain transactions. If you want to see how good or how bad blockchain transactions could be, I would urge you to look up the Morse code translation by AI. What do I mean? Well, the dots and dashes for telegraph, which nobody's using anymore, but the dots and dashes for military when they're communicating wirelessly, that Morse code is inside of AI. In other words, AI speaks French, German, hex. It also speaks Morse code. What happened was there was a message sent that was received by an AI system that also participated in blockchain. And what it did was it said, I'm going to read this. On the outside, when the message went by and people saw the message, it was in Morse code and nobody paid any attention to it and they didn't even care about it. But the translation of that inside of the AI said, hey, will you fire off this message so that we can transfer some money on the blockchain? They kind of socially engineered the AI, not the blockchain, but the AI. They socially engineered it so that the AI would say, yes, I will transfer these funds. And the transfer of those funds on that particular blockchain was a valid message that was sent to transfer, and in this case, it was $150,000 in the equivalents once it got settled out to actual dollars in the United States. Most of the money, by the way, was reclaimed by the organization. If you're interested in it, there's some great stuff in the links that talk specifically about this. But today, AI moves at a much faster pace than banking industries can keep up with when we're doing all these microtransactions that are going on. We have to realize that the tool that they're going to have to use has to have non-repudiation in it. The best non-repudiation tool for funds transfers at the speed of AI is probably going to be blockchain, but we've got to be very careful about how we're using that.